Blaming the Poor, the long shadow of the Moynihan report on cruel images about poverty. I'm Mike Adekunle, and this is Bookmarks. Hello and welcome to Bookmarks. I'm your host, Mike Adekunle. With income inequality becoming a 2016 campaign issue, renewed attention has been focused on poverty in America. A major event in how Americans think about the poor was the 1965 release of Daniel Patrick's Moynihan's report, The Negro Family. The Moynihan report sought to explain the causes of poverty among African Americans, ending up as an indictment on the black family. A new book, Blaming the Poor, The Long Shadow of the Moynihan Report on Cruel Images About Poverty by Susan Greenbaum, criticizes the Moynihan Report and its effects on social policy. Dr. Greenbaum joins us today. She is Professor Emerita of Anthropology at the University of South Florida, where she specializes in studies on race, poverty, and income inequality. She has authored, co-authored, or edited dozens of books and articles on those subjects, including More Than Black, the Afro-Cubans in Tampa. She joins us via Skype. And also joining us via Skype to critique the book is Bradley Schiller, Professor Emeritus of Economics and Public Policy at American University. His book, The Economics of Poverty and Discrimination, has been the standard textbook of college courses on race, poverty, and urban problems for 40 years. He evaluated under federal contracts all the major anti-poverty programs and conducted some of the few longitudinal studies for poor families ever done. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
So, Dr. Greenbaum, could you please give us in a nutshell the main thesis of your book?
My thesis is that the Moynihan Report was and continues to be a very flawed piece of research, and it has become a convenient trope that's been used to vilify poor people as opposed to shine light on the structural conditions and the sort of ongoing problems of access to opportunities that have, I believe, and I'm not alone in this, been the major causes of this increase in poverty and the stubbornness of its persistence. And what I have attempted to do in the book is to interrogate both the concepts and the methods that were behind it and the implications that have been drawn from it, which I believe have been highly politicized. I try to examine this within the context of several different policy areas where I submit has the Moynihan Report has had, or the messages of the Moynihan Report have had ongoing negative impact. This is in urban housing policy, in the policy of mass incarceration and criminalization of poor, especially Black and brown youth. And finally, in the commercialization of the culture of poverty as a way of sort of instructing teachers in what is construed to be the dysfunctional upbringing that poor children bring to class with them, as opposed to any of the problems that are afflicting our educational system from without.
Okay, thank you.
I conclude with a statement that we need to stop vilifying the poor and start partnering with them in search of solutions that are actually targeted at the real problems they're experiencing and that make use of their own initiatives and their own insights into what would make their lives better.
And Bradley Schiller, what is your critique of the book?
Well, first of all, let me say it's a very exhaustive review of the research over the last 30 or 40 years on Black poverty. I think it would be a very useful textbook for graduate courses. It's not a general reader. It's much too dense as a general reader. But there are some serious flaws, in fact, an Achilles heel in this book that I would like to discuss. Let me start by saying that there's a mutual distrust and certainly skepticism between economists and anthropologists. Anthropologists are always criticizing economists for relying too much on statistical analysis. Their critique is that statistics are always unreliable and they never paint a complete picture of the human behavior that's being studied. Economists, for their part, are always criticizing anthropologists. They say anthropologists engage in very personal, very specific studies of families and individuals that can't easily be extended to larger groups. It's hard to decide from an anthropological study whether that study is representative of the larger population. So there's always this little bit of distrust and skepticism between the two. What I want to focus on in my critique is Professor Greenbaum's statistical critique of the Moynihan report. She has stepped across the line. She has engaged in a statistical critique of the Moynihan report, and I'd be happy to talk about that now or whenever you think it's appropriate.
I'd like to remind the audience that you can submit your questions to our guest through our website, www.publicsquare.net, and we'll answer as many as we can live on air towards the end of the show. So Mr. Schiller, could you give us some insights as to when you feel the professor stepped over the line?
Yes. Moynihan's statistical observations were fairly simple and straightforward. He observed that the number of single-parent Black families was rising. It was an upward trend. At the same time that unemployment rates were falling. And so he said, you can't blame the increase in broken Black families on economics, because the declining unemployment rate would have created more opportunities for Blacks and others, minorities, to get jobs and have intact families. The controversy at the time was whether economics was driving illegitimacy or whether illegitimacy had a trend that was impervious to economics. And so he looked at these two trends, the upward trend in illegitimacy, the downward trend in unemployment rates, and said there must be something else besides economics driving these high rates of illegitimacy among Black families. And those divergent trends came to be known as the Moynihan scissors, one blade going up, one blade coming down. And Professor Greenbaum focuses on those two trends. And she claims that Moynihan was wrong, that he misread the data. And she offers two observations in her book. First, she notes that all statistics have a margin of error. No statistics are perfect, but everyone knows that. That's an innocuous observation. We know that weather statistics are bad, but we still look at weather forecasts. We know that voter surveys are unreliable, but they do tell us something about trends. We know that climate change data is imperfect, but we still use that data to draw some conclusions about what's happening to the Earth. Saying that Moynihan used statistics that were not perfectly reliable doesn't really tell us whether his thesis was right or wrong. If the statistics are unreliable, we don't know if the correlations he found are stronger than he suggested or weaker. We simply don't know. But she makes a second critique, and this is where Professor Greenbaum makes the fatal plunge. into statistical analysis. Professor Greenbaum says that better data refute Moynihan's observations completely. She says that the unemployment rates for black males were rising, not falling, during the early 1960s when Moynihan was making his observations. Now that's a serious accusation. I mean, in academics, that's almost equivalent to the charge of plagiarism. She's saying that a senior official of the US Department of Labor was misreading data on unemployment rates. I mean, that's an incendiary accusation. So one has to ask, what is the basis for Professor Greenbaum's accusation? Well, she cites only one source, a paper written by Laura Carper in 1966. And in that paper, Laura Carper asserted that black unemployment rates were rising, not falling, 1960 to 1965. Well, who is Laura Carper, one might ask? She was a civil rights activist employed by the Michigan Civil Rights Commission. She was not a statistician. She was not an economist. She was not even an anthropologist. Yet Professor Greenbaum, who warns us about the unreliability of statistics, takes Laura Carper's paper at face value and uses it as the linchpin for her criticism, refutation, if you will, of the Moynihan findings.
Okay.
Well, there's a serious problem. Let me just offer one more observation. The data that Laura Carper asserts in her paper of 1966 doesn't exist. There was no data on black teenagers before 1972. I've even gone back to the Department of Labor to verify that again. Before 1972, the kind of statistics that Laura Carper cites in her paper simply did not exist. So Professor Greenbaum's reliance on Laura Carper's assertion is really the Achilles heel of her entire thesis.
It's not just Laura Carper who claims that Moynihan's scissors was an aberration. It is also Alice O'Connor, an esteemed historian who has written about the whole industry of poverty research, and she agrees with Carper and she has validated her assumptions. Piven and Cloward also have made that argument, and although I did not attempt to go back and interrogate the original statistics, that piece was reprinted in the Rainwater and Yancey compendium of responses, and there was no criticism of it there. I think it's also interesting that the only people who cite the scissors are people like George Will, who bring it up as if it were somehow a invariant relationship. If you look at, I believe, and I haven't attempted to do this, at least not systematically, if you look at the relationship between black male unemployment and welfare enrollment going down and the black male unemployment going up, that's another scissors that has drawn very little comment. The idea that the increase in welfare enrollment during the early 60s, which is the other part that you don't mention, was somehow related to some narcotic addiction to dependency and preference to get welfare rather than to get married, I think is an oversimplification. I totally disagree that the scissors is a competent measure or that it bespeaks causation. It was a very temporary switch in those directions. And I don't know where Laura Carper got her statistics on young men as opposed to the general population of African American men, but assuming that she had some from some source, it's certainly a more relevant way of measuring what was going on within the couples that might have gotten married during that period. It certainly is not the only problem with Moynihan's methodology.
Mr. Schiller, I'm curious, do you believe that the conclusions drawn by Moynihan's report as regards his scissors is a correct one, or is it just something that is open for interpretation?
Well, I would say two things in that regard. Professor Greenbaum just acknowledged that she didn't go back and check the Laura Carper data. She also just said that the kind of data that Laura Carper asserted would be more useful in evaluating the Moynihan thesis. But I am stating unequivocally that such data doesn't exist. And Laura Carper's paper, even if it was cited by a couple of others, was based on non-existent data. And I think Professor Greenbaum has to recognize that her statistical critique of the Moynihan observations is simply unfounded. Now, you ask an additional question. Are the interpretations of the Moynihan scissors relevant or correct? I would go back to the Moynihan report and note other statistical relationships he noted. He noted that when unemployment rates go up, Black families separate at higher rates. So he acknowledged in that report that economics was driving a lot of family fragmentation among minorities. And in fact, he was one of the first ones who emphasized that we had to create more job opportunities for Black males if we were going to stop the disintegration of Black families. So I don't think I think what Professor Greenbaum tries to do is attach an interpretation to the Moynihan report that is unidimensional. And that was not Professor Moynihan's intent nor his conclusion. And secondly, the one aspect that she hones in on is a statistical observation that remains valid today.
Okay. Professor Greenbaum, you do point out that regardless of the statistics and what Professor Moynihan's intentions were, the takeout from his reports and the effects are mostly can be boiled down to two things: the culture of poverty and the tangle of pathology. So regardless of whether that was his intention or not, that is the main takeout, and that is what has caused the most effect. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, certainly. That is the message behind the report, and that was what he intended in terms of looking at whether or not there were the cause was racism or the cause was some kind of internal failure in the African American community. The Moynihan report stands apart from Moynihan the man, Moynihan the senator, Moynihan the liberal. The Moynihan personality should be off the table. This is not an ad hominem argument. This is an argument about ways in which a piece of literature that was created in a matter of months in the Department of Labor in 1965 leaked to the press before it had been reviewed internally, and right in the midst of the Watts uprising, which Moynihan then turned around and said, the reason I wrote this is because there had been all these urban disturbances. That is the crux of it, that it was an alternative explanation for the discontent of the moment. It was an alternative explanation for why Black poverty existed. And the fact that he was also interested in Black male unemployment and other aspects that would have solidified family structure, this is something that's been known to anthropologists for a long time. There's no disagreement that unemployment and marital breakup are tied together. unemployment and not marrying at all are tied together. And this is a global thing. This is not a black thing. And one of the problems with the Moynihan report was that he made it a black thing rather than looking at the way in which poor black people were trying to manage their households and their domestic survival. And although he makes peripheral mention of middle-class families that had similar kinds of characteristics to middle-class white families, was off to the side and was not part of the way it was interpreted. It was interpreted as pathological black culture is keeping people in that society, in that community, from being able to achieve anything because they are poorly reared and they have defective values.
Bradley Schiller, do you agree that that was the takeout from the report? That is the main takeout?
No, I really don't. I think that the major conclusion people drew for policy purposes at that time was that we had more emphasis on job opportunities for minorities. And in fact, that report spawned lots of programs that were designed to increase skill training, job opportunities, and education for minorities. I think the secondary conclusion was that, yes, outside of that core problem of economics, there was a pathological pattern in black families that made them resistant to increased job opportunities. And it was particularly focused on the rates of illegitimacy, unwed mothers, not the birth of intact families. And let me make one more observation, if I might. Both Professor Greenbaum and Moynihan paid way too little attention to the dynamics of our socioeconomic behavior. Broken families don't remain broken. Unwed mothers don't remain unwed. They move back and forth across different family structures over very short periods of time. And also on poverty. People don't stay in poverty for long periods of time. It's not the same families all the time. Only 2% of all poor families today will be poor in 5 years, because the family structure changes, the income opportunities change, the actual income changes. And so to characterize a certain family structure as immune to economic opportunity may be true, but somewhat irrelevant if that family structure is subject to continual change. Unwed don't stay unwed, broken families don't stay.
All right, let's take some questions from our viewers. And I have the first one from Russell Wright. What is the relationship between poverty and the assimilation into greater American culture?
Well, I'm not sure what's meant by the greater American culture, but assimilation into the greater American economy is an extremely effective tool against poverty. And the integration into the economy begins with decent schools and decent jobs and a lack of discrimination in the workplace. And it's been shown that employers, particularly employers of unskilled labor, which is one of the entry points into the economy, have extremely negative attitudes about black workers, even in cases where they have hired black people and had good experiences with them. They simply reflect the stereotypes that have been embedded in the public narrative about the unreliability, the dangerousness, the potential criminality of black men. And this has been shown in many, many different ways, both experimentally and in naturalistic inquiries.
And Bradley Schiller, do you have a different take?
Not really, although I think the question turns more on immigration of people from different countries and cultures and languages than on the black experience per se. And immigrants come here primarily for job and economic opportunities. they tend to assimilate into the American economy in a relatively short number of years. And I think a key question there is how fast they acquire the English language and attend American schools, and therefore expand their job and economic opportunities exponentially. But immigrants generally have had a good experience in achieving, the American dream, or at least climbing some of these steps on that ladder.
Okay. Take another question from Alicia Cooper. This one, I believe, is for you, Professor Greenbaum. Are you saying that nobody is poor because of bad decisions they have made?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that Black people are not poor because their culture is somehow deficient. I think that there is pathology up and down the hierarchy, and certainly the stresses that exist in neighborhoods and in poor families generate behavior that is often dysfunctional. So no, I'm not saying that.
And obviously, Mr. Schiller, you will not say that either.
No, in my textbook on the economics of poverty and discrimination, I identify three broad causes of poverty. One is flawed character, which would be the dysfunctional Black family or other minority family or white family, a dysfunction of some sort. Restricted opportunity, which is what Professor Greenbaum emphasizes almost exclusively, which means discrimination, lack of job opportunities to force families into unwelcome behavior. And the third broad cause is Big Brother, government programs that create disincentives for people to acquire the skills, education, or jobs that they otherwise might do. And of those three broad causes, the argument is really all three are relevant. Simply a question of which is more relevant in any period of time.
Okay, that's all we have time for. Again, the book is Blaming the Poor, The Long Shadow of the Moynihan Report on Cruel Images About Poverty by Susan Greenbaum of the University of South Florida. Thanks to Dr. Greenbaum for joining us to discuss the book, and to Bradley Schiller of American University for his critique. And thanks to you for watching Bookmarks. I'm Mike Adekunle, and we'll see you next time.